Hello and welcome to this discussion with Professor Mustapha Ben Hamouche on the evolution of Muslim cities in North Africa and the Middle East using the lens of chaos theory and complexity. We will begin this discussion with the colonial imagining of these cities, how they saw them as being disorderly from the perspective of Euclidean geometry, completely lacking in straight lines, grids, and circles. Over time, this imagining has become more nuanced, and today we have a much better understanding of how these cities have evolved. A fractal geometry as a consequence of processes such as repetition, iteration, and the passage of time. Now, these processes have been a result of two forces. One is certain basic norms of urban living at close quarters, and the second being Islamic jurisprudence. Professor Ben Hamouche helps us bring all of these ideas together to get a deeper understanding of the cities of North Africa and the Middle East. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you.
So once again, welcome to this discussion, Mustapha. Really a pleasure having you over. As I mentioned to you before, there were two of your papers that we had read and really enjoyed that talked about chaos and fractals in the context of traditional Muslim cities of North Africa and the Middle East. I think one was can chaos theory explain complexity in the urban fabric, and the other was decoding the irregularity of the Kasbah's urban fabric. And both of these are very interesting. As you know, some of the work that we have been doing revolves around applications of the ideas of complexity science to cities and urban systems. A lot of my own work has been focused on India, so it was really interesting to see the work that you had done. But before we get into talking about the fractal nature of the cities, I thought it would be useful to take a step back and talk a little bit about how Muslim cities, Arabic cities, and North African cities in general were initially understood. And by that I'm talking about the colonial literature that emerges on Muslim cities, right? So this is a literature that is steeped in the sort of European colonial project, and which places a high value on architecture of the Greco-Roman type. We see the emergence of Cartesian geometry and those sorts of aesthetic values. And in that context, Muslim cities are often, and you mentioned in your papers, they are deemed disorderly, right? And this disorderliness was also then extended to not just the design of the city, but to culture and society at large. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about that imagination, the colonial imagination, and then we can come to our discussion on how that changes over time.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Anand. And I would like to thank you also, thank the Madras complexity. Madras complexity collective. Yes. For giving me the opportunity to talk about these Muslim cities. I first start with my first early teaching of architecture, where I got the early lessons in architecture in Algiers in late 70s, where most of the teachers were from Europe. And they used to teach us how cities are organized, and what is urban planning, what is architecture. And then we had a course on the history of architecture in North Africa. And there they used to present our cities as sort of disordered, and they have no clear geometry compared with the Roman and the early Greek architecture that are based on a very clear grid of Cardo de Camanus. So as a student, I couldn't resist, but I couldn't accept it. And that's why that gave the shape for my life to look again and what my early teachers of architecture and urban planning were saying, and that was sort of references not by teachers, but the whole literature of what we call Orientalists, the scholars who are interested in the Oriental civilizations. They are mentioning this, that whether in Algiers or in Damascus or in Baghdad, they have cities, but they don't have geometry, and they have the urban order. And they always compare it to the European cities. And that was the starting point. Then I found in my PhD that by digging deeper in the literature, a new generation of Orientalists that said that this disorder is not chaos in this negative sense, but it is a higher complexity which has its own rules. And one of the earlier French scholars had discovered a manuscript that's explaining what's happening exactly in the quarters and the rules that govern the action of people and the outcome at the street, at the level of street and the buildings, etc. And that was the first changing trend in the studies. Then I found a fresher PhD thesis from MIT and from USA universities saying that the Muslim cities, they have their own rules of organization things. The earlier ones were of Jamil Akbar and Saleh Hadloul, both are the PhD graduate from Harvard and MIT, saying that these cities have their own rules, and they found some references from earlier books in the history of cities, how they are built and how they are governed by rulers, etc., with giving the larger margin of freedom for people to do their own city. And they were not governed exactly in all details by the architect and by the rulers. So, right. And then later on, I found that this maybe 90s, this word that I consider it as always negative, chaos, that it became a positive term that explains many things, not only in architecture, but in many other fields in physics and astronomy and nature and biology, etc. So that's exactly the starting point on the relationship between chaos in the positive sense and the Muslim cities.
Sorry, I was just saying that in your paper, you mentioned that Muslim cities are of 4 types. One is the religious city, like Mecca and Medina.
Yeah.
Then you have the royal city, like Baghdad.
Yes.
You also speak of inherited cities, like Damascus and Aleppo. And finally, spontaneous cities, which is like, most of the other cities. So can you just talk a little bit about, this categorization and, what that tells us?
Yeah. So there are sort of academic classifying of cities for teaching purposes, that we have these principal cities, mainly Baghdad and in Andalus, in Muslim Spain, where there are very few cities like Kufa, earlier Kufa, that was clearly planned by rulers. Then we have the inherited cities from pre-Islamic city like Damascus, that existed long before the arrival of Muslims, and many other cities. But most of cities are I can imagine that they were spontaneous in the, again, positive sense, that they were not planned by rulers or by urban planners. They emerged according to the conditions of the site and for example, the crossing of two roads of or existing of a source of water or something like this. So, and these are maybe 90% of the cities. And paradoxically, those who were planned, they died. For example, the round Baghdad and Al-Zahra, for example, in Andalus, they no more exist as planned cities. And the spontaneous, they have this condition, natural conditions of living. And that's why, because I think it's a sort of natural process of emergence and the existing and the growth. And this is very important that what we are teaching now, that we should control cities and we should plan their foundation and follow them in their growth through master plans and things, etc. So I'm telling to my students that if we see what's happening in history, it's completely different from what we're teaching. But this is very difficult to say that in the official programs, because we are supposed to teach the rules of urban planning according to Western rules, land use and the setbacks and the height of buildings, and so we should control every detail of the city. So this is the paradoxical situation we are in our countries. We have cities, very organic cities, very spontaneous. I don't know if you heard about Gardaya and Kasbah, that are classified by UNESCO as international heritage, and they are completely spontaneous. We don't have any plan of their foundation, neither of their growth, etc. But we often from each year, we take our student to go there and spend some time there and understand what's happening, and then they come back to practice our academic Western way of teaching. So I think this is a point. And then I understood that this not only applies to Muslim cities, but many other civilizations in India, in China, even in USA, when, for example, in Latin America, one of the British architect whose name is Turner, John F.C. Turner, went to Brazil and studied the favela and found that when we leave people do their own cities, it gives a sort of miraculous results. But once we go as architect with our casket, or what you call official status, we destroy this natural process, and we start to apply or force people to respect our rules and things, and this is the problem, not giving enough freedom to people. And by the way, these are considered as anarchist architects. They are not accepted.
Right. No, absolutely. And I was particularly struck when I was reading about, you speak about the evolution of these cities in the Muslim world. And, you speak about a city like Damascus, which, as you said, is a Hellenistic city, and it was found with like a grid pattern. But over time, whether it's Damascus, Baghdad, any of these cities, they are much more characterized today by narrow winding roads and dead-end alleys, interlocking buildings. That's what you mentioned. And that the geometry in some sense of a Damascus changes from, Euclidean sort of geometry to what we recognize as a fractal geometry. So if you can talk a little bit about, what is the role that time is playing here in sort of creating this transformation from, Euclid to Mandelbrot.
Yes, yeah. In fact, this is one of the studies of a French historian named Sauvager in 1930. He, I think, spent around 10 years in discovering or rediscovering the grid under Damascus with this attitude that Muslims have destroyed all the geometry that was there clear with the Cardo de Cumanus and things. And so he has a very famous sketch of earlier Damascus before the arrival of Muslims. And that was one of the points of my starting point for studies. In fact, this geometry, it is a sort of initial geometry that also existed in Baghdad with around city. And then things were left to people, the residential level, to do their own urban fabric according to their spontaneous needs, and also according to some rules of neighborhood, respecting our neighbors, our relatives who are next to us, etc. So, I mean, the recent studies that found that there is sort of self-regulation in these quarters, and people, they know that they do damage to each other, but then there is sort of regulation, natural regulation. And of course, there is a minimum presence of authority in case of dangerous conflicts or serious conflict. So there was a sort of urban control to make sure or to maintain the minimum order for the traffic and for people to live in peace, etc. But these are very few moments in the life of the city. The other times are people, they don't know, they know what they should do and what they should not do in their cities, opening a window and what is impact on the neighbor. So they know that there will be erection. So we should choose another alternative for having, for example, lighting or ventilation, etc. So this what self-regulation has, created the sort of urban management in the city without the direct presence of the authority. And when we go deeper, we find that there are some rules, very few rules, for example, respecting your neighbor, or when you die, your property will be subdivided according to the inheritors. And if your neighbor give you, you have your privacy should be preserved, and you should preserve the privacy of others. 5 or 6 rules, very basic rules, and then they give this complexity at the city level as well as the quarter or residential level. And then now it is in a way responding to this theory of simple rules make a very complex systems. And that's why this my main hypothesis of my studies, that these simple rules, we should discover them, and we should convince people and the decision makers. Then we should reduce the amount of regulation we have of setbacks and the percentage of land use and etc. If we are convinced that these cities were functioning well, so why not taking these lessons from the cities and applying them in our cities? And one of these problems is the building permits in our cities. They follow the Western rules of geometry, of percentage of opening, to have a garden in your house, etc., etc. But people, they know that if they don't have this permit, they will not be able to build. But once they get this permit, they do their own design, and it is completely different from what the architect have designed. And this is the diverse between the practice and the practice of people and the official regulation. And I guess that this is also happening in India and many other cities where the authority is in a sort of for a weak position to control the large cities due to their complexity.
Absolutely. In fact, a similar story can be said about, most Indian cities, given the, age of many of these cities. They're quite ancient. And that over time, a lot of the action has been very local. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, there are two kinds of things happening here. On the one hand, you have people following very simple rules, like making sure that, you don't affect your neighbor, making sure that privacy is protected. Very, very simple rules. But the other thing that you mentioned, which was also very interesting, was that there was also a relationship to Islamic law and jurisprudence on specific conditions that needed to be followed, especially with relation to, the private legal power, inheritance. Can you talk a little bit about how that also impacted over time the construction of these fractal cities?
Yeah. In fact, there is this part of religious rules where we don't find them in as strict urban regulation, but in the corpus of the legal corpus, what we call fiqh or jurisdiction, Islamic jurisdiction. And we have 4 schools that you may know, the Hanafi that are mostly from Pakistan, India, maybe part of Iraq. And we have the Maliki school in North Africa, in the Spain, Muslim Spain. And we have Hanbali, who are mostly in Saudi Arabia. And the Shafi'i maybe in majority in Egypt and Syria. But most of the schools agree about 4 or 5, up to 10 major chapters in Islamic jurisdiction that have a direct impact on space and on architecture. I give you the most striking example is the orientation to Qibla. Qibla is the orientation of Mecca, where people should pray and mosques should be directed to Qibla. So when we see a city from Google, for example, we just go to the mosques and we'll find the orientation to Qibla. The people, before they start their cities, they build their mosques directed to Qibla. So in our case, in Algeria, we orientate to east, whereas for example, in Turkey to the south, etc. And in Yemen, for example, to north. So Kaaba or Mecca is becoming the center, the geographic center of all Muslims for all mosques. Then we have other rules, like, for example, the inheritance law. When somebody dies, their property, his money, and the assets should be divided according to very strict rules. For example, his wife should take 1/8 of the property, whereas the children, the girls and boys have twice the girls, because the boys have their own house, and whereas the girl will go to another house. So to subdivide this asset, we have sort of equation that, example, that they have their mother, we take the 1/8, and the 7/8 would be subdivided to third, for example, and 2/3. So you imagine this mathematics, and this is only a calculation. Then we go to the land. We have to apply this rule on the ground, and there are more complex situation where we have a whole house that should be subdivided as far as it is functioning. So people will take, or the inheritors, each one will take one part. So imagine his wife will take 1/8. So they should have their own access for each one. And then the house becomes a very, very complex building with 3 or 4 new entrances and with windows, etc., etc. So this is only at the scale of one house. So imagine that is repeated 10 times a day or 100 times of a year. So this will give a sort of fractal geometry at the city scale. It is really beyond the scope of our mind to understand all these details, why this door is here and not here, and why this window is up and down, etc., etc. So all the details of the city can be explained through this mechanism of subdivision. Then we have another mechanism or principles what we call preemption. The preemption is that the rule that gives you the right to take back the part of your brother if he wants to sell it to a foreigner or a third party. So you are more rightful to buy it before any foreigner. So then this is a sort of adjust the subdivision of the heritage that people who are in the house, they have the right to get back the part that would be sold to other people. And then that will keep the homogeneity, social homogeneity within the residential quarter. And people generally, they don't ask or they don't sell to foreigners. They know that there is this rule. So they first start with their neighbors and relatives and ask them whether they want to buy their part or not. Then they proceed with the foreigners. So this preemption, it maintains a sort of social cohesion within the quarter. Then there is the rule of forbidding any harm to from in the neighborhood. For example, you should not open your windows that has some intrusion on the courtyard of your neighbor. And if you open it, then you will have a very bad relationship with your neighbor, and imagine that will continue through years and days and things. So it will push you now to refrain from any harm to your neighbors, because you are living together, and your life will not be happy with all this conflict with neighbors. So there's a sort of self-regulation, not to do harm to other people. But sometimes it happens, and it is often registered in courts. And that the only things we find in the court, only this exceptional part where the ruler or the judge intervene in case of conflict that could not be solved at the scale of the neighbors. And then it is done through a decision, an official decision, that you have the right, or your neighbor will have the right to do or not to do the things. So this then, the intervention, the few moments of intervention of the judge and the ruler by force to solve problems at the scale of neighbor, or even a larger scale of cities. So this rule, there are other rules of partition walls. So for encouraging people to build shared walls instead of having double rules for if you are two neighbors, you have two houses. So it's better in terms of economy, both in terms of building materials and land use, to have one wall, and that will reduce the amount of land that we are using in residential quarter. Otherwise, we will have houses very distant from each other. So then this of encouraging people by religious recommendation have led to many partition walls that are very shared. And there is a sort of prophet saying that if your neighbor asks you to put his beam on your wall, you should let him, and you get rewarded afterward. So people by religious conviction, they let their neighbor to put their beams on each other, and that's the result at the residential scale. All houses are interlocked, and they have shared walls. And if one house collapses, it touches the other houses. So that's why they should all keep their houses compact and in a good status, so that they don't collapse. And paradoxically, now in old cities like in Kasbah, unfortunately, the original people have left and left their house, and the houses collapse. And one house, once it collapses, it leads to the collapse of 3 or 4 neighboring houses, because the whole system has collapsed. But in other cities that are still living, they have this compactness in the cities, and it is very, in terms of climatic performance, it is excellent. We don't need AC, we have always shade, and we have ventilation, etc. So, and now, by the way, compactness is one of the concepts of principles of sustainability, climatic sustainability, not to have buildings very distant from each other and having the ACs and things. It's better to have houses that touch each other, so that we have this thermal performance at the block scale.
Right.
So these are some of these rules.
No, this is actually very interesting, because at the end of the day, what is happening here, I guess, from what you've said, is that you have sort of social rules that how you behave with your neighbors and the neighborhood, and then you have jurisprudence that together over time have led to partition and subpartition and the creation of these cities. And in some sense, I mean, at the end of the day, we know that fractals are generated by processes of constant iteration, self-similarity. These are the processes that lead to the creation of a fractal architecture or a fractal geometry. And it's very clear from your description that what is happening here through inheritance law, through preemption, is sort of a constant process of iteration and self-similar architecture that is being followed in smaller and smaller places. So you can see that a fractal geometry would sort of emerge in a place like that. Actually, just as one of the earlier conversations we had in this series was with Professor Kirti Trivedi in India, who is a designer. He's a scholar in design. And he had written a paper about 40 years back on the fractal design of Indian temples. And really the core message there is that the fractal architecture is emerging again because of iterative processes, self-similar processes that lead to the emergence of fractal geometry. And I think it's important to sort of remember that to create complexity, you don't need to start with complexity. You can start with simple rules. It just needs passage of time and iteration, and fractality will emerge, complexity will emerge.
Yes.
So,
in fact, yeah.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
Yeah, in fact, I am very happy that the 10 last years that the many science have provided tools for architects to understand what exactly happening in the nature and in the world. Because unfortunately, architecture and urban planning was highly influenced by the modernism and the Cartesian school, like Le Corbusier, I think very famous architect who was Chandigarh,
Yes.
designed Chandigarh.
Absolutely.
And they became the god of architecture in all of schools of architecture, who believe that they can control the forms and cities and buildings through geometry. And the geometry of the right angle and the straight line and the exact symmetry and the rhythm and the artistic way and things. So these are rules that emanate from the Euclidean, what we call or called the Euclidean geometry, where the architects seek for sort of precision and total control of the form. But now with the computers, with the AutoCAD, for example, and many new software, even this precision has become very, very subjective. I mean, there are, when we, for example, take the image of a city through satellite image, then we start to analyze it. We found that there are many layers of geometries, and this grid is sort of very, very initial. Even those cities who have been planned, that was the initial condition of the city, on which many other layers came out, a consequence of practices through decades and decades. So then, even in the facade, the elevation of buildings and the external walls, where architects, they have this idea of giving a picture, a very ideal picture of rhythm and symmetry, or very known rules of art. It is now becoming controversial because sometimes, due to this form, the rules, we might find a large window facing a toilet or something, because we are abiding some rules that don't go with the internal functions. So with the fractality, there is a sort of changing trend in architecture, and the forms are no more very clear and things, becoming more complex. And this is both in professional and academic field. In academic field, we have found that the earlier temples or mosques and things, they don't have this pure rectangles or circles or forms, what we call Platonic forms. They have very irregular forms that respond to the topography. I mean, the form of the land, whether it is a mountainous or coastline, etc. And then the incremental way of building. I mean, each year or each decade, there is something that is added to the temple or to the mosque. So this incrementality and the initial conditions and the emerging uses of people, because we cannot see, forecast what would the people in 10 years need. Their needs are changing. So these are all the conditions that led to what we call this fractality in both in architecture and in urban planning. And now I
Right.
think with also the emergence of what we call this intelligence, collective intelligence, by comparing, for example, human beings as entities with ants and with fish and with other animals, they found that they have their rules, internal rules, intrinsic rules that regulate things within this, I mean, community of people, of fish or something. And this then should be understood, and then it is I mean, they are the real rules, instead of starting from our imaginary ideas or mind. And this is, I think, very important thing that in architecture, in the Western side, we always Platonic way for the forms, whereas in this, what we call fractality, we start from the initial conditions of the site. They give the initial idea of starting a project. And these are two schools of thought in architecture that have totally different results in terms of architecture. And now I think, although it is still at the emergent scale, I mean the fractality and chaos, but it has deeply influenced this old Western way of thinking architecture and cities.
Right. Yeah. In fact, just sort of extending that what you were saying in your paper, you discuss when you're discussing the complexity of housing in Algiers. I think you make a very interesting point that housing is not a physical structure but a process.
Yes.
And that it's an algorithmic process, right? And in speaking about this algorithmic process, you sort of make a distinction between two sectors, the private and the public, in shaping the built environment, right? So can you I want you to talk about both of them, but first about what you call the linearity in public decision making and why that yields this Cartesian sort of geometry. I think that would be
Yeah, that in fact, this idea, I took it from this British architect, John Turner. He said that housing is a verb and not a noun. That is an excellent starting point, that the house should not be a very static form that is forever, because your name never change all your life. And it is a verb that has a past and has a present and has a future. So it keeps changing over time. And this has given way to a new branch of housing that we call incremental housing. By the way, there is a famous Indian architect whose name is Charles Correa. Who has also applied this by giving a sort of core house, a very part of house, that and give the chance to people, to residents, to develop it according to their affordability in terms of finance, and also their needs. Initially, they are only a couple of men and women, and then they will have kids, and then the kids they will leave and things. So there is a very very dynamic metabolism within the family, and that should be reflected in housing. And that was applied in Peru, in some of projects in India, and by the World Bank to propose list of idea of incremental housing that buildings or houses should be developed through many stages instead of building for once for 50 years or 100 years, because that doesn't, respond or reflect this social and biological reality of the society of changing and things. And now, there are many architects who are thinking about this incrementality, how it could be achieved, especially in the developing cities where we have very scarce financial resource, and we have to distribute it over hundreds and sometimes thousands and millions of people. So either to build very well-furnished cities and let the others wait, or we have to spread this, few amount of money and financial resources over a large number of people, and they all have their small bit, and they will have this core house, and then let them prepare or develop their own house over time. And this is, by the way, what's exactly happening in the informal settlement. There are many studies who are studied this bidonville and favela and squatter settlement and shanty towns. They found that people, they start with very, very initial amount of money, and they have their own shelter. And then by the time this shelter becomes better and better because of the new financial resource that come with the income of the father and the mother and maybe the kids. And then they, after 20, 25 years, they get their normal house that we see. And some explanation to this informal housing that because of the fear from the authority that people cannot invest, that once they get this insurance of land, or that they will not be, their house will not be demolished, they have this courage to invest and to improve their house. So the official system of regulation and building and the building permit, etc., is working against this informal settlement. And once we leave people without fear, the quality of the cities become better. Of course, there should be a minimum presence of the city, the police and the controls and things. But once people have this peace and have this feeling of not being punished or under threat of, they do their best to improve not only their house, but even their surroundings, the courts and the street, etc. They put flowers in the front of their house, and they always keep clean their surroundings, etc., etc. So this is what the incrementality in the domain of housing has brought as a new idea to improve the conditions of poor people and even the middle classes. I mean, the more we give the people the chance to participate in shaping their environment, the more we get healthy cities and involvement, direct involvement of citizens in the city planning.
Right. And in fact, that sort of nicely ties in with the conclusions you draw about the fact that when you allow for more private decision making, which is really a bottom-up sort of, allowing people to make their own decisions, you see the emergence of a fractal geometry over time, right? And the opposite of that is, of course, when a king or a government, tries to impose a certain kind of design that is often very, grids and, blocks that sort of yield a very, Euclidean geometry. So the top-down sort of version is Euclidean, whereas the bottom-up is fractal. And for cities that are sustainable, like you say, the best usage of space, the most energy efficient, we're probably better off allowing for more space for people to make their own decisions and not criminalizing it, or
Yeah.
all the issues that you raised. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think you mentioned this issue of decision, and this is also a key word in urban planning and the architecture, that before any building to be built, there is a decision to build, and who is behind this decision. And in the case of the city, from my studies, I found that all cities, they have two types of buildings: the major buildings like the mosques, the temples, etc., and the minor scale, that is the largest amount of buildings is that of the citizen. So the major buildings, they are it's a sort of the outcome of a major decision. To build a temple, to build a large mosque, etc. And then the people, they start to build, so in a very short time, so they built this temple or mosque or a church, etc. But the small decision is taken by the users and the resident, and it is not taken at once. It is the more they need things, changing or adding a room, etc., or transferring some, maybe a door to another place. So they take this decision, a very small decision, what we call the incremental decision. And this in geometry, it is very clear. I mean, when you see a city from top, you will find this clear geometry of roads that are made by the governor, by the municipality. They don't have time to go in complexity, so they do a major decision, and the people they undertake the changing or the shaping of their environment. So they have all the time with this small actions to build the city. So in fact, the city is made of this increment of a small decision of people. Imagine that with 1 million or 2 million, each one is doing something of his bit, while the government, as an entity, as a major actor, is doing the street and the road and the large places and the temples and the municipalities. So that explains, I mean, this double presence of simple geometry of buildings and large buildings, and the complex geometry that is non-linear, that is practiced by people each day, and in an unpredictable way, because we don't know a user what would need he need in 2-3 years. For example, maybe his wife dies or something, he will get married or something, and this has a direct impact on his house. So this unpredictability has direct implication on the geometry and the form of the buildings and the urban fabric in general. So these are the two ways of decision making that have two outcomes on the city level.
Absolutely. And one of the examples and one of the areas that I think you've also studied in great detail is, and you mentioned this before, is the Kasbah of Algiers. I think you said it's a World Heritage Monument now, or a World Heritage Area. I wanted, can you talk a little bit about the morphology of the Kasbah itself? Because that is a part of Algiers, I think many people outside of Algeria have heard about. And, it has a fractal sort of, geometry there. So if you could talk a little bit about the history and the morphology and how we end up with the Kasbah as it is today.
Yeah. In fact, Kasbah is the old part of the Algiers city now. It is just a historical quarter. It is facing the sea quarter on the sort of mountain. And each house has its own terrace that open to the Mediterranean coast. And it's a very fantastic architecture that was built in starting from practically 1530 by the arrival of the Ottoman. There is a sort of regional conflict of Andalusia that was under the occupation of Muslims, and then it was taken back by the Christian. So most of the Muslims came back to the North Africa. So they developed all the coastal cities, like in Morocco, like in Tunisia, and in Algiers we have Oran, we have Bijaya, we have Delis, etc. So then this has had been developed a sort of city, defensive city, because there was a sort of war between Christians and Muslims, the Crusade. And then there is a sort of, in a way, a split between the authority that is Ottoman and the local people that are Arabs. Most Ottomans are Turks from Turkey, and local people are either Arabs or Berbers. But there was a sort of agreement that as Muslims, we should be defended by the powerful empire at that time. So then the Ottomans took part in the shaping of the city by building the city wall, and let people, both Andalusian, who came back from Spain, and local people, to develop the city within this city walls. And amazingly, they were also, the street were controlled by the Ottomans. At the end of the street, there is a sort of governor's house, and then the city was subdivided naturally into quarters according to the origin of each resident. There was Berbers, there were Arabs, there were Jews, there were also few people from Turkey. So they have a sort of small villages within the whole city, and each residential quarter has a sort of autonomy. They have their own small malls, they have some shops, they have some primary schools in a way, and they are a sort of autonomy. And then at the lower part of Kasbah, there was a sort of the city center where there was a large market that was also organized by the Ottomans, sort of urban control called Muhtasib, who used to go through street and change anything that is constraining the traffic and maintaining the order within the street, and controlling also the quality of the goods, whether they are original or they cheated. So people, they have this what we call symbiosis between this local authority, who know where to stop, and the whole people of small small communities who have their own autonomy at the scale level, and they contribute with the city, the authority to maintain the whole city and daily life of the city. And they have a sort of common culture in having one same type of house, that is courtyard house. So they have some similar shared language of architecture. Each house has a courtyard and have a terrace that is open to the sea and have an indirect entrance, what we call skifa, so that when the door is open, we cannot see directly into the courtyard. And the openings on the street, on the outdoor wall, were very few because we already have a courtyard inside the house. So we don't need the openings outside, I mean on the walls, only very few. So that allowed the houses to be adjacent to each other and to have inward-looking architecture. So most of the daily life was, occurring inside the house, either in the courtyard or on the terrace. And there is another sort of social agreement that the man should not go to upstairs until night. And only the women who have the right to go to the terrace. And then, amazingly, that they can visit each other on this terrace. Imagine they have long speeches during the morning because their husband, they go to market or they're working and they come back at late day. So they have the full day to do the things on the facing the sea and talking to each other. And the main life, in a way, it was either in the market or the workshops, etc. So this is a source of symbiose between architecture and this social life with the social code, etc. So this, I hope that I gave you an idea about what was happening in Casbah. Because you should have a sort of image to understand this thing.
No, thank you. That was a beautiful picture that you painted. I really appreciate that. So Nishant, do you have anything to ask?
Yeah, so I think one last question was, tied to something that you had spoken before, because now that you know and you kind of tell us that these kind of participatory planning efforts, which include, people who are part of the community to make changes on design, on architecture, and on the planning of the city. I wanted to speak in something about if you could take a real example of where it really affects it. So one is on the distribution of houses, how they look, etc., which you talked about, but more about something like how does it affect the city itself, or something more real. Like I know one paper you talked about traffic accidents and how the nature or architecture of the city might actually lead to more or less traffic accidents in the city. So I was thinking more about when you talk about regulation and when you talk about central control, is there something that you see in these fractal cities that has a real impact on like a qualitative indicator of a city?
Yeah, you mean in nowadays or?
Yeah, going forward, giving the idea that to preserve this fractal nature of these cities that you have, how do they kind of help going forward in terms of keeping some a qualitative indicator of the city better or improve it?
Yeah,
improve the quality of life in some.
If I understand your question, I think that now there is a really fractality and complexity and things are mostly in academic, professional way that are developed, but still the practice in place, they are following the old system. In most of the countries, both developed countries and the developing, where the informal is the rule. And I think that fractality would contribute in giving more chance to people to involve them in improving their city and their immediate environment. And the more they have this chance, the more the city will belong to them, and then automatically or naturally improve in terms of quality. Because now most of people, I give you the example of the Gulf cities where I live, for example, in Dubai or in Doha, where the governments are very powerful by the financial means they have. So they make the very amazing, between bracket, cities with the high rise and things. But people, they just are consumers, and everything is artificial. And the hidden cost of this thing is not known by most of people. Through the AC, through the energy, through pollution, etc. And people are becoming more and more less involved in the development and the maintaining of the city, because the government is doing everything. But in other cities where, or countries where they have very scarce resources, we have, for example, Egypt or maybe poorer people, poorer countries. The government, they don't have this enough money to shape the city, so it is left for the cities and for the citizens, and the result is there a sort of disorder in terms of traffic, in terms of overuse of the infrastructure and many things, because people, they cannot improve things that they belong to the government, because it is beyond their reach and their scope. So we have these informal cities that have low quality of life. So if we, as scholars, if we can convince people, I mean, to think about this way of doing the city through incrementality, through predictability, I think many things will change in regulation and the system of controls, and will even reduce the rate of bureaucracy we are using. For example, in master plans that are not working, in urban regulation, and the document we are putting just to have these permissions for practicing activities or building our own house. All this will be reduced. And I think now at the regulation level, I mean, even in the international commerce, etc., they have this trend of deregulation. I mean, freeing the regulation or the market from the strict regulation. And the more we free it, the more we have this freedom and coordination between people to improve their life and the quality of improve their quality of cities.
Okay,
I
thank you.
hope I respond.
Yeah, I mean, I did. It was a tough question, so I got it. But I suppose I understand what you're saying. It does make sense over a long period of time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. Anand, do you have any more?
Just thanks so much, Mustapha, for taking the time and, walking us through a really interesting topic, discussing the fractality and how this sort of emerges from the actions of people. Really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully, there are areas, there's something that, we are looking to do at the end of this year, is a conference on ancient Indian cities and urban planning, and really to get a sense of, what do we know? What is the state of knowledge about, old Indian cities? What was the state of these cities, and how they've sort of evolved over time. And your work is a great example of that in a different context. But there's a conference that we are sort of trying to put together at the end of this year, similarly to understand processes, actions of people, culture, and religion, how they sort of play into the emergence of urbanism. So thanks so much. Really enjoyed your work. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Kumar, and I think it's really a very fantastic moment to talk about many ideas I didn't have in mind before, but the questions have allowed me to reorder my knowledge, architecture, and this chaos and complexity. And I wish, I think what you are doing is really exceptional at the international level. I hope that you will continue with this thing, because you are joining many people in different fields to come up with common things. And that will have, I'm sure that will have a very good result in the future for many fields of science. And thank you
so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.